Hello and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh channel. Today we're going to be looking at the new Yu-Gi-Oh Arc V, which is coming out of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. It's going to be the brand new world, which I estimate is going to happen sometime at the end of September. If you want to, I've got a description of a video that I've just posted alongside that as well, and just have a check on that. Today we're going to be discussing potential decks that we'll see within the immediate release of Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V. The despots are a series of Earth Attribute Machine type monsters. They have different levels, I think ranging from level 1 all the way up to level 9, and they all have 500 attack and defense. Now what's interesting about these cards are, for the most part, they are just normal effect monsters. The 1, 2, 3, 4 and I think 9 as well are all just effect monsters. However, it's 5, 6, 7 and 8 which are all Pendulum monsters. The reason for this is they range anywhere to help you special summon any of these monsters, and it's meant to be like a hybrid deck, so you'll have a version of the effect forms and you also have the special summon from the Pendulum forms. Since we already have the other cards within the game, it would make very much sense for them to introduce these. As you can see here, this is the example of Deskbot 05. Its basic effect is when it's normal or special summoned, you can destroy a spell or trap card on the field. It also gains attack points 500 times the number of extra deck cards you've got that are face up. So over time within a duel, it will actually become a lot more powered up, considering the other Pendulum monsters, when they're destroyed, will go straight to your extra deck. It's a decent effect, and the Pendulum scale itself is a 10. That means it helps to some of the highest monsters that you've got within it. The only conditions, of course, with the Pendulum effect is it does limit the Pendulum summons to despot monsters, so it is very specific to its archetype. And here we have the example of Despot 06. Again, it has the ability to boost its attack points 500 times the number of face-up Pendulum monsters that are Despot archetype based, that are face-up within the extra deck, so it becomes also a little bit more powerful. Unlike 5, this one has a Pendulum scale of 1, so it helps to special summon anything between 2 and 9 if you use the two of them in combination with each other. Again, this has its own unique effect in that it changes the battle mode of one of a face-up monster, so it can be yours or your opponent's. You have that choice. Despot 07 has the effect where it can make itself the attack target of any of your opponent's attacks rather than any of your other despot monsters. It gains 500 attack for each despot monster you've got in your graveyard, and it has the piercing battle damage. It's also a Pendulum scale 10, much the same as the Despot 5. And the last one we'll mention is Despot 08. Its ability is it can let itself attack up to twice per turn on monsters your opponent controls. It does, like 7, gain 500 attack for each of the despots currently in the graveyard, and it does prevent your opponent from targeting any other monsters you possess with card effects outside of this card. Now, the reason I consider the despots to be as useful within Arc V is simply because they're already there. You've already got more than half of them within the game. I think you also have the Synchro monster as well, which is Despot Jet. And I think you've also got the field spell, which means you're really only missing the Pendulum monsters. They've only introduced those and forgotten about them just because we haven't got this world in yet. It's definitely an option, and it's very simplistic gameplay. It's very easy to understand the different effects and how to Pendulum summon with this deck. So I think it's advisable that they do introduce this as a main mechanic. Now, whilst I was doing my research on this, and I was looking at the original packs that came out, the first one being the Duelist Advent for Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, meant that we had a series of these so-called normal monsters. So they would have, for example, a Pendulum-based effect, but they would have no effect in terms of their monster effect, which meant they were half like treated as a spell card and half treated as a normal card. I think for the most part they will introduce these quite early because it's a good way of getting new players understanding Pendulum skills, rather than having to understand you've got a Pendulum effect which is completely separate to its monster effect and not being able to understand how both can interact with each other effectively. This is one of the first examples. This is Dragonhorn Hunter. It's a Dark Attribute Warrior type Pendulum monster. It's a level 6 with Pendulum scale of 3. It's got 2,300 attack and 1,000 defense. And it basically says, as Pendulum effect, all normal monsters gain 200 attack you take no battle damage from battles involving normal monsters you control. It's a simple effect. It actually works with a number of normal-based decks. For example, Gem Knights actually work quite well with this. I'm sure there are other examples as well. Some of the elemental heroes, some of those are normal monsters and can actually rely on this type of effect. It does give you a little bit of protection as well, even though it's a very minimal boost. It's a good way of introducing people to the game. Flash Knight is another example of something from Duelist Advent. It's a light attribute warrior type Pendulum monster. It's a level 4 with a Pendulum scale of 7. It's got a 1800 attack and 600 defense, and it has no effect whatsoever. I would compare this to things such as Gem Knight Pearl, which is an example of an Xyz monster that has no ability but has to be summoned in its exclusive way. This again, being completely vanilla, is just to focus on the Pendulum scale. By it being a 7, you're able to basically special summon anything that's level 6 or lower. So long as, you've got another Pendulum scale that's lower than this scale, you're able to special summon anything in between those scales. It's okay. Again, it's very simplistic, but I think it's a good way of understanding, and I'm sure this will be something they introduce very early on. Volkl's Canon is a dark attribute spellcaster type Pendant monster with a level of 5 and a scale of 2. It's got 2200 attack and 1200 defense, and the Pendulum effect, once per turn and during the end phase, if this card was activated this turn, you can target one face-up spell or trap card on the field and destroy it. Again, it doesn't have a monster effect to its name, and it's purely here for its Pendulum effects. It's decent because it can get rid of a spell or trap card so long as it's face up, so that can include field spells or anything that can actually annoy you. It's decent just because it's a 1 tribute monster and it's actually focused to try and special summon itself as a vanilla monster. It works alongside that Dragon Horn Hunter and would be a great demo card to help people understand the game. Now here's one you probably all expect to see: Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. It's a dark attribute, dragon type Pendulum effect monster. It's a level 7 with a scale of 4, 2500 attack and 2000 defense. The Pendulum effect, you can reduce the battle damage you take from an attack involving a Pendulum monster you control to 0. During your end phase, you can destroy this card, and if you do, add 1 Pendulum monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand. You can only use each Pendulum effect of Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon once per turn. And the monster effect, if this card battles an opponent's monster, any battle damage this card inflicts to your opponent is doubled. The reason I say this is going to be an obvious card is, even if it might not be a physical card, it will probably come as a character ability for Yugioh Sakaki. Like some of the other cards before they get their official release within any sort of pack, some of them do have like a character effect where you can actually just bring those cards out. It also has an original version which is not a Pendulum monster, and I think if that's going to be a physical card, that's probably going to be the first one before this. Its effect is okay. It does protect you from taking any battle damage from Pendulum-based monsters, and it does let you search for any other Pendulum monsters that's 1500 or less attack, so that does act as a rotor for the deck. It also has the monster effect to double any battle damage you do to your opponent, which can be in itself game-breaking and game-ending. Performapal Kaleidoscope is a light attribute insect type Pendulum monster with a level 6 and a scale of 4. It's got 100 attack and 2300 defense. The Pendulum effect, all light monsters you control gain 300 attack, and the monster effect, once per turn you can target one face-up monster you control. This turn it can attack all special summon monsters your opponent controls once each. This is one of the last Pendulum monsters that's actually in this set, and I think it's quite decent. It does give all your light monsters an additional 300 attack point boost, which can work with lots of different types of decks. The scaling on it isn't very good. It being a 4 means anything lower than a 4 is very limited for you to summon, unless your other monster happens to be a scale 1, in which case you can summon a 2 or a 3. But generally, the lower the scale, the more likely and more flexible you can be with summoning things from your hand between those levels. Anything mid-range on the scale is usually more difficult to do this with. The ability it has for the monster effect to just let your monsters just attack into any special summon monsters your opponent has can be enough to wipe their opponents out if they're relying on a very special summon heavy deck. or even if you're facing it off against a rival Pendulum deck, as all those monsters will likely be special summoned from the hand. Performapal Turn Toad is a water attribute, Aqua type Pendulum monster at level 2 with a Pendulum scale of 3, 0 attack and 800 defense. The Pendulum effect, once per turn you can target one face-up monster on the field, switch its current attack and defense until the end of this turn, and the monster effect, once per turn during your battle phase, except during the damage step, you can target one monster you control, change its battle position, and if you do, switch its current attack and defense until the end of this turn. So both effects happen to switch the attack and defense of an opponent's monster, so this is very similar to a monster version of Shield and Sword. Again, this is the last one that was actually mentioned within Duelist Advent. I don't think they will be looking at any of the other packs, especially looking towards some of the later introductions of those packs, because they're just going to be introducing these newer ones to certain players. In terms of the characters, I think you're only going to get maybe 2 or 3 of them. You will probably, it's the same as with Yugioh Zeal. Initially you started off with 3, you had Yuma Tsukumo, you had Bronk, and you had Tori Meadows. Those were the 3, and then you eventually got Rio Castle, Reginald Castle, Shark, Kite, you've had Trey, you've had Quattro, and some more of those characters. With this, I think you're going to get Yuya Sakaki, female lead, who is known as Zuzu, and you will also get, I think it's Yuya's best friend, who's called Gong Strong, and his monsters were basically the super heavy samurai cards. I'm sure those will be in there as well. I don't know what Zuzu's going to have, maybe her melodious cards, as that's the archetype she was working with. Those are a bunch of fairy type monsters, mostly light attribute, that do have the ability to go into certain fusion monsters. That was mostly how her mechanic worked. She did focus on fusions. I would also like to note that you'll probably get both Stargazer and Timegazer Magicians, because those were the original Pendulum monsters that you started off with, alongside his Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. Stargazer Magician is a dark attribute spellcaster Pendulum monster. It's a level 5 with a scale of 1, 1200 attack and 2400 defense. Its Pendulum effect is, if a Pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate spell cards until the end of the damage step. Unless you have a Magician card or Odd Eyes card in your other Pendulum zone, this card's Pendulum scale becomes 4. The monster effect, once per turn when exactly one other Pendulum monster you control and no other cards are returned to your hand by an opponent's card effect, except during a damage step, you can special summon one monster from your hand with the same name as that returned to the hand. So this card has the ability in its Pendulum effect to prevent your opponent from activating spell cards during the battle phase. It shuts them down from using those. It's useful for things like quick play spell cards such as Shrink, where typically if you've got things like Jinzo out, you can't actually negate. But it does have the downside of, you have to have a Magician or an Odd Eyes, otherwise this scale becomes a 4, making it more difficult for you to Pendulum summon. The monster effect I wouldn't rely too heavily on. It being a level 5, you're not likely to just normal summon it as a tributed monster. It's most likely just going to be in the Pendulum zone to use its first effect, and for its scale ability to summon as many cards from your hand as possible. And the other card I'll mention is Timegazer Magician. This is dark attribute spellcaster type Pendulum monster. It's a level 3 with a scale of 8. It has 1200 attack and 600 defense. The Pendulum effect, you must control no monsters to activate this card. If a Pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate trap cards until the end of the damage step, unless you have a Magician card or Odd Eyes card in your other Pendulum zone. This card's Pendulum scale becomes 4. And the monster effect, each turn the first cards in your Pendulum zone that would be destroyed by an opponent's card effect is not destroyed. So again, like Stargazer Magician, this actually negates trap cards as opposed to spell cards, so it's actually very useful. It does give you that protection during your battle phase. It has the same limitations that if you don't have the relevant cards, it does become a Pendulum scale 4, making it more difficult to special summon things from your hand. The monster effect is actually arguably better, because it does provide your Pendulum zone with a once per turn protection effect, which is a good way to prevent your opponent from disrupting your plays. Overall, I think these are the types of cards I will likely see within Yuya Sakaki's deck, and the cards we'll likely see within the initial introduction. I'm sure there will be some more Pendulum cards or maybe one or two more than what I've already described. If there's any more, I will always go back and I will actually revisit this video, and I will actually critique this as well, just to give me like a forethought for something to predict in the future. I'll also actually be making separate videos to go over the cards I'm likely to see with the Zuzu's deck, and also to do with Gong's deck with his super heavy samurais. I'll also make a separate video of the cards I expect to see within Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V within the initial release that aren't exactly Pendulum monsters. So, for example, his Performer Pal monsters, some of his other generic monsters as well. I'm going to be describing some of the key cards I think might be introduced through those. So I hope you will enjoy it. Make sure to subscribe. I appreciate every subscriber I've got.